Hello and good morning to all those just logging in. We'll get started here in just a moment, just letting everybody log in and get ready. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome everyone to the 8th installment of California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. So this month, our host, Elaine, a wine writer and educator, continues the focus of her conversations with top California producers on questions of discovery, legacy, and innovation, diving into how their own winemaking has changed in response to working with new regions or new varieties, and how the work of other producers, both past and present, has inspired them to challenge norms. So today we have the privilege to welcome Steve Lagier and Carole Meredith of Lagier Meredith Vineyard, and special guest Anthony Truchard of Truchard Vineyards. So first, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. First, please ensure you have your Zoom screen set to speaker view. There should be an option to select it at the top right corner of your screen. And during the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants that we encourage you to use. There is a chat section as well as a Q&A section. So these are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. So just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And then there's the Q&A section. So this is important. This is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and our guests to answer towards the end of the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, but please know that if they're not answered live, then they will be provided in the Q&A summary in the email you will receive following the program. So in that email, we will also provide a list of export markets for the wineries represented. So now I'll turn it over to our host, Elaine, wine writer and educator. She writes for her own website, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, for jancisrobinson.com as the American specialist, and contributes to a long list of respected publications. And Steve and Carole, husband and wife owners of Lagier Meredith Vineyard in the Mount Veeder AVA of Napa Valley. The two have lived there since they bought the property in 1986, first planting vines in 1994, and producing their first commercial wine in 1998. Carole and Steve have no employees and do the vineyard work and winemaking themselves. So over to you, Elaine.
Great. Hello. So nice to see you both.
Good morning.
I want to especially thank you for being here because, as Katie just pointed out, you literally do every single bit of work yourselves. And that includes all vineyard work, all winemaking. And the thing people often forget is the inordinate amount of paperwork that goes into making wine and having a winery. And so you're two of the busiest people I know. And I really appreciate you making time to be here.
It's our pleasure. You know, it gives us an excuse. I mean, you think that it's a big deal for us to take time out of our busy day, but we think of it as a relief. My God, we get to sit inside and do something a little bit different.
And on a warm day like today, not a bad thing to be inside right now.
Well, and Steve, I know you were outside actually doing kind of property maintenance this morning, but could you tell us what stage the vineyards are at? Some people don't realize, but for vineyard work, this is one of the busiest times of year.
Well, the vines are just at the beginning of bloom, and we have this nice warm weather, which is perfect for bloom. And there's a lot of shoot positioning and shoot thinning and suckering that we've already done. And, you know, the canopy is beginning, it's going up into the vertical trellis, and the vines are actually really beautiful right now. And we've done mowing, and I'm a little concerned that in the forecast there might be some rain this weekend. That could be problematic with the bloom. You get poorer set with rain, but you know, it's a few days away. I'm not sure that it's going to rain that much.
Well, because the bloom is actually where the little flowers come out on the vine, and the flowers, of course, turn into fruit, but the rain can keep them closed shut.
Well, actually, it washes the pollen grains off, and you get a lower percentage of set.
Right.
And that's the problem.
Right. And so you end up with lower yields and more scraggly clusters then.
Yes. Which, you know, for some people that might not be too big a deal. it depends on which variety we're talking about, but in our Mongoose, it might be a good thing to have
Right.
that.
A blessing. Yeah.
Right, because it's such a high yield variety.
Yeah, we have thin, less fruit then.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to start with, you are two of the most technically trained people in Napa Valley. You know, so Steve, you were actually, of course, studied viticulture and winemaking at UC Davis, but also did research work there, and then went on to have a long winemaking career before starting your own winery. And Carole, you of course have this incredible background in grape genetics, and really actually changed the world in terms of our ability to track parentage in grapevines. You know, I like to call you scientist legend when I'm not talking to you directly, but the reason I bring this up is because, again, you're two of the most technically trained people that I know in wine, broadly speaking. But when it comes to your vineyard work and it comes to your winemaking, you're not doing a lot of technical intervention. You're actually using that to inform a more intuitive approach. Could you talk about the relationship of those two things, the training to the choices?
You want to go or you want me to?
I can start.
Why don't you
I can
start?
start. Well, I think people do assume that we're using lots of technical tools. I mean, there's all this technology, and we, of all people, would be the ones who would employ it. But you know, you don't have to do that. When you grow grapes and make wine, people have been doing it for thousands of years. And they do it by being close to their vines and by using their experience and their intuition. And that's what we do. We live on our vineyard. We see our vines every day. We know how they're feeling. And we never, ever used a soil moisture meter. We haven't had petiole analysis to check the nutrient status. You know, we just look at them, and we've got enough experience with our site in particular that we have all the information that we need. And because we have scientific backgrounds, we use our observations and we integrate that with the knowledge that we have to try to understand what's going on. But we don't collect data, we don't make measurements, we just look at them.
In a funny way, we do collect data in that, using soil moisture as an example, if you look at a vine and you look at the shoot tip and the tendrils on that shoot, just how they appear tells you the water status of that vine. Is it as precise as a tensiometer or a perometer? No, but you get plenty of indication by just looking at your vine when you're out, you know, removing laterals or thinning fruit. You can feel the vine, you can feel how much moisture it has, and you can just look at its appearance, and that's enough information. And you know, there's a lot to do, so gathering a whole bunch of superfluous information isn't going to really make our wine better.
Right.
You may have heard of analysis paralysis, and that's what we like to avoid here.
Right. But it seems like it's partially a difference in size, so to speak, because you live there on the vineyard and can go into it every day. You can have that kind of direct intimacy, whereas a project that might be larger, or perhaps the person can't do all of the work themselves as you do, then the data analysis might help in a different way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. If we had a 300-acre vineyard, there's no way. Then you do need to gather
right.
data, and it really changes the project.
Right. Yeah. So let's go ahead and look at a map so that we can see where we're located. You know, you're there in Mount Veeder. Part of what I am so excited to talk about with both of you is Napa Valley, of course, by now is very intimately tied to the idea of Cabernet Sauvignon, but you actually started your vineyard with Syrah. And in fact, Mount Veeder has a history of Rhone varieties. Just as an example, we had Steve Edmonds on a few weeks ago, and he started Edmonds St. John by making Mourvedre from Mount Veeder as well, that had been old vines there. So could you tell us here what we're looking at and about your site? What makes your site unique there in Mount Veeder?
Please go back one slide. Yes, good. So on the left side of the screen is an aerial view of our vineyard. And on the right side, the white circle indicates where we are. So we're on kind of a mountaintop northwest of the city of Napa. And our little vineyard, you can tell by looking, is completely surrounded by forest. So our house is there in the middle, and then we have a number of different vineyard blocks with 4 varieties planted. But we're surrounded by wild land. We don't have any other vineyards adjacent, contiguous with us. There is one vineyard to the north of us and one vineyard to the south of us along the ridge that we're on. But other than that, we're surrounded by a lot of wilderness, which is great for diversity. We have got birds and animals like you wouldn't believe. And a lot of birds like our place because they have the shelter of the forest, but then they have the openness of the vineyard, and they love to perch on the vineyard posts and jump down for bugs. We have a great hawk, Ethan Hawk, and he loves to sit on the posts. And especially when Steve has the tractor out, it's almost like he is magnetically drawn to the tractor because he has learned that it scares up little rodents for him. And so he sometimes jumps down right behind the tractor and nabs something and then flies off with it. So it's great to live here on such a wild piece of property.
I just want to mention one thing about our vineyard site. So on the left-hand side, you can see that aerial view of the vineyard. Our property wraps over the top of a ridge that goes roughly from the northwest down to the southeast. A mile north of us is Jim Paris's vineyard and Aaron Potts' vineyard. And Jim Paris's vineyard is the old Veeder Crest vineyard. A mile south of us on the edge is the old Brandlin Ranch. And that's where Steve Edmund is Movedra from.
Right. So let's go ahead and look at one slide forward, Katie. This just kind of puts Lagier Meredith in relation to Napa Valley as a whole. So you can see that the vineyard is on the western side, or the eastern side of the Mayacamas range. Mount Veeder actually goes right up along the Napa-Sonoma County border. But as we saw in the last slide, because you're wrapping the top of a ridge, you actually have vineyards facing in multiple directions, and again, surrounded by forest. But one of the things there too is, again, notice you're on a ridge line for the Mayacamas, and we've talked about how incredibly varied Mount Veeder is. Could you tell us a little bit about what the soils are like there where you are?
Mount Veeder is really very diverse. You know what, when you're farming on a valley floor, like the Napa Valley floor or any valley floor, it tends to be fairly uniform. The vineyards are flat. You can have nice straight rows, and every vine has a pretty similar experience compared to every other vine. But on mountain sites, you have little patches of vineyard that face east, other patches that face south. Our vineyard, I'd say it's about 2/3 east facing, a little bit west facing, and a little bit of south facing. So you have all these different aspects. You have different soil depths. If you're a vineyard block that is right on top of a ridge is going to have much shallower soil because the topsoil gets washed off by rain. If you have a little swale, that's going to have a little bit deeper soil than other parts. So it can be very, very diverse. And so you really have to farm block by block. You can't just treat it as a single plot. Even though our vineyard is very small, we have it divided into 8 blocks. And even within those blocks, we have to treat the vines at one end of the row a little differently than the vines at the other end of the row. And that's all because of the complexity of our site. Mount Veeder also, unlike a lot of the other mountain vineyards, Mount Veeder is the southernmost mountain appellation in Napa. So when we look out from our house, we actually see the San Pablo Bay,
right,
which is the northern extent of the San Francisco Bay. And we get a distinct ocean breeze every afternoon. It's the same breeze that blows over the Carneros appellation.
Right. Well, and we're going to talk about Carneros in a little bit too. And one of the things that people are asking, we should clarify, Napa County very strictly controls tree clearing, and especially in mountain sites. But when you purchased the vineyard, it was actually had been cleared by a previous owner already. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were fortunate in that regard. The previous owner did not farm the land, but the previous owner had bought it with the expectation that they could prepare it somewhat and then sell it to somebody who wanted to farm the land. And so some of the property had been cleared for 100 years. It's a very, very old home site. I mean, we have some olive trees here that are 140 years old. Some of it was cleared more recently by the previous owner, but we did not have to do any clearing. Now, when we first acquired the property, the regulations weren't all that strict.
Right.
But in 1991, the conservation regulations really got ramped up. And now if you want to clear any forest, either for vineyard development or for any kind of, for a house, for example, any kind of, you have to apply for an erosion control permit, and it's highly regulated. So we were fortunate in that we got this small plot of land that had already been pretty much cleared for us.
Well, and so one of the things that, let's go ahead and start looking at the Syrah, because one of the things I find interesting about your wines, you know, as you mentioned, you have 4 different varieties planted. We're going to look at 2 of them. But even though the 4 varieties are actually quite different from each other, there's this kind of intense concentration and spiciness that naturally comes with each of them. And I find that fascinating. One of the things that we should mention too is Mount Veeder is actually incredibly varied when it comes to soils. There's sections that are very volcanic and there's sections that are actually uplifted seabed. And if I remember correctly, you're in one of the sedimentary seabed areas, isn't
Right.
it?
We're on what's called Great Valley seafloor. So the Great Valley seafloor was laid down in the Central Valley about 100 million years ago, as opposed to Franciscan seafloor,
Right.
which is down out in the Pacific Ocean. And we're in a funny little island that exists on the flank of Mount Veeder that was not overlaid more recently, like 5 or 10 million years ago, by the Sonoma volcanics. And the geologists are kind of at a loss to explain why that is, but it is. And we're on sedimentary. It's shale and sandstone.
I love though that of course the 2 of you would pick a site that no one could explain. You know?
Geologists have been here, and we're this little island of uplifted seafloor surrounded by a lot of volcanics. And I mean, we didn't know any of this when we bought the property, you know. That's another thing. People assume we must have really extensively studied all the available properties and then made a decision to get this one. We did none of that. We looked at 70 properties and we went for this place because we love the view. And we do love the view. And that's what you can see behind us is the view. And it was only, and when we bought the place, we also had no plans to farm it. We bought it as a place to live. We both had full-time consuming day jobs, expected that we would stay with them. And so when we bought the property, it was a place that we could afford. It had a fantastic view. We thought maybe we'd grow a few vines just for ourselves. But it turns out that it is a great place to grow grapes. It has fantastic soil. We love the cool temperatures. We have a very nice groundwater supply, which is in the mountains. You just never know what you get if you drill a well. And we are on a fantastic supply of high quality water. And we always say that if the bottom falls out of the wine business, we'll sell our water.
Well, so when you started, you know, as you mentioned, both of you still had your other jobs, and Carole, you were still at the university. And I know before you planted grapevines, you were starting to consider Syrah, but you had a really important guest at your home for dinner who confirmed he thought Syrah would be the right choice. Could you tell us about that?
Well, but this is Jean-Louis Chauve. He took Carole's international viticulture class
At Davis.
And again, Jean-Louis Chauve, famously from the French Chauve family, known for their Syrah from the Rhone.
The 15th generation of owners of that property. Yeah, Jean-Louis spent a year at UC Davis, not that he needed to learn how to grow grapes and make wine, but his father at the time thought it was really important for Jean-Louis to get some exposure to other wine growing regions in the world. And so he came to Davis and took all our classes. And one of them was a class I taught on international viticulture. where I felt a little awkward when I'm trying to explain the French system to these American students, and there's Jean-Louis Chauve sitting in the back of the room. But I got over it. Anyway, he came to our place, and we stood on the deck overlooking the view that you see behind us here. And we hadn't planted anything. This was back in what, 1991?
Probably
91.
Yeah, 91. It was 91.
So I said, Jean-Louis, you know, we're thinking of planting Syrah here, because Steve and I had already considered that we thought Syrah would be our choice. I said, we're thinking of planting Syrah here. What do you think? And he looked at me and he says, Carole, I think Syrah will do great here because Syrah loves a view.
And so here we are. I want to tell you too, in early 2013, I made my first trip to Australia, and a family there was going to be hosting me through most of the trip. And so I said, you know, I can bring you any wine from California. Is there something you want? And they said, the only wine we need is Lagier Meredith.
Really?
Yeah. And so that's what I did. I had a suitcase of your Syrah, and I brought it down to Australia, of all places, to share with them there. Yeah.
Wow.
So over time though, you moved from Syrah to also including these other varieties. I know in some ways, Carole, your grape genetics research informed the things you also chose to plant. Can you just briefly tell us about how that connection was made?
Yeah. So we planted Syrah because we really loved it, and we thought it would do well on our site. But after a few years, we really felt that we wanted to diversify a bit. And at that time, so now we're talking the early
mid 2000s.
2000s,
Yeah.
And we had recently in my research lab at UC Davis, we had begun to do a lot of DNA profiling of classic wine grapes all over the world. And we discovered that we could figure out where a lot of them came from by finding other varieties that were closely related to them, even as parents. And then we could, by just deductive reasoning, figure out where a variety came from. And so one of the varieties, just coincidentally, one of the first varieties whose origins we discovered was Syrah. And it turns out that the parents of Syrah are a black grape called Dureza and a white grape called Mondeuse Blanche, which is grown east of the Hermitage region. And then when you further investigate Mondeuse Blanche, you find out that it is the offspring of Mondeuse Noir, which is a classic ancient red wine grape of the Savoie regions. It's a mountain grape, and it makes very aromatic, age-worthy wines that are grown in the Savoie. And we were looking to plant another red variety, and that just seemed like just the perfect choice, because not only could we have a grape that really sounded intriguing to us, and we did taste a few examples from France, because there are some in this country. We thought it would give us another very interesting red. It was a mountain variety, which seemed like an appropriate choice for us. And it would allow us to kind of, in a geeky way, compare the two. Let's compare Syrah to Mondeuse, because in France, all the Mondeuse is grown in the foothills of the Alps. It's high altitude, short season, quite a cool climate. And the wines tend to be fairly light bodied, very aromatic, aged for decades, but light bodied, more like a Pinot. And so we thought, well, how much of that characteristic is due to the site and how much is due to the inherent characteristics of the Mondeuse variety? So by planting Mondeuse in our vineyard side by side with Syrah, we would be able to make that comparison. And so that's been really, really interesting. What we get on our vineyard is not a light-bodied red grape.
No.
An intensely full-bodied red wine that is usually richer and darker colored than our Syrah.
Well, and one of the things I think that's fascinating, when I have the chance to taste your wines in a row side by side, the site character is so clear. Again, there's that sense of spiciness that crosses the four varieties, but also this, there's a kind of denser weave. The wines are not overly dense, but I feel like with Mondeuse, it's such a good example of how everything sort of gets a little compressed and concentrated, compared to those examples from the Savoie you're referencing, you can see how the site just like, it's like it compacts the character of the wine and brings this sense of sort of intensity and density.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all of our wines are concentrated, both in flavor and in color. And that's in large part due to our shallow soils here. Because we have shallow soils, the berries, our berry size tends to be quite small. And so you get a lot of flavor packed into a small berry.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and look at the Tribidrag, because I know with you, of course, am I correct, Carole? It was 96 that the first parentage was successfully confirmed for, and in that case, it was Cabernet?
That's right. It was actually published in 97, where we almost serendipitously discovered the parents of Cabernet Sauvignon, which are Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. And people, in retrospect, would say, well, couldn't you tell from the names? I mean, Cabernet, Sauvignon Blanc, I mean, duh. And no, nobody had ever suggested that was the origin of Cabernet Sauvignon. And it was surprising because what we now know is that Cabernet Sauvignon is a relatively young variety. And, it was probably, it probably arose in the 1700s as one of the varieties that survived a really terrible frost in Bordeaux.
Well, and so again, I want to emphasize, the idea of great parentage is something that we take for granted today in wine, but in actuality, until you and your team in 1996 sorted out how to determine great parentage, and again, the first case with Cabernet Sauvignon, we actually didn't know most of the relationships between different varieties. But now eventually, one of the last major projects that you did work on while still at UC Davis was finding the home origin of what we in California call Zinfandel. And that also then informed what you chose to plant there at Lagier Meredith. And so the second wine that we're looking at is your Tribidrag.
Here's the Syrah.
And now, Steve, one of the things I want to ask you about too, with the winemaking here, I know that with you had worked with Syrah previously through other vineyards, and from what I recall, you hadn't worked with Zinfandel, but you had certainly been around it quite a bit. And could you just briefly comment on what kinds of things about working with the fruit from your site with these two varieties surprised you?
Well, Zinfandel has a challenge in that there's uneven ripening in the berries, or in the clusters. So you have to let it get a little riper, and Zinfandel can also be pretty prolific and be overcropped. So we have to thin it a little bit. But our soils kind of limit the amount of fruit that we can get and limit the size of the berries. So the wine or the grape growing is fairly simple. It's vertical, everything's vertical shoot positioning, and it's the same spacing. And the fruit ripens a little bit after our first Syrah, but we do 2 or 3 pickings every year anyway. So usually it's the second pick that we pick the Zinfandel. All of our wine is made in small fermenters that are hand punched down. Very simple winemaking. We don't tend to emphasize the winemaking. We spend a lot more of our effort working to get really sound fruit, because that's where nature's put the flavor into those berries, and then it's just up to us to capture that character.
Yeah. Well, and I love the range of flavors in your Tribidrag. That it's there's this sense of like firm, fresh fruits, even mixed currants a bit. Yeah, but again, that zesty, spicy element that you can see in the Syrah as well.
Yeah, typical for Zinfandel, or Tribidrag as we call it, is a brambly fruit, and then just a touch of spicy black pepper. Ours has an additional extra character that is a little bit elusive to describe. I've at times thought it was a cinnamon character, and I've never smelled that in another Zinfandel, and other people say it's allspice. I'm not really sure. It has lots of spicy character.
Yeah, and it's coming from the site, not from the from the
That's
vessels.
probably, yes.
Yeah. Well, so Carole, you just commented that, you know, Cabernet Sauvignon we have discovered is a relatively young variety. And you, of course, as we mentioned, helped determine the origins of Zinfandel there in Croatia. But since having done that work, you've returned to Croatia and the team you worked with has been able to continue doing research. And could you briefly tell us, there's been a lot more learned about the history of Zinfandel and how long it has been around.
Right. So we found Zinfandel in Croatia in 2001, going, of course, by a different name. And that's why it took so long to find the home of Zinfandel, because Zinfandel is a made-up California name, and no other country has a grape by that name. So in 2001, we found it growing there, going by a couple of different names. One of the names was Tribidrag, starting with a P. But in the Natural History Museum in the city of Split, there's a wonderful herbarium collection of all the wine grapes that were being grown on the Dalmatian coast around the year 1900. And among those, so these are dried leaves, among those was a sample called Tribidrag, and its leaves sure looked a lot like Zinfandel. But at the time, back around 2001, we knew it was there. My Croatian colleagues, Ivan Pejic and Eddie Malatic, looked at it and they were pretty convinced that it probably was Zinfandel. But this is an herbarium specimen. These are dry, dead leaves that have been sitting in the museum for 100 years.
You can't do genetic sampling from dried leaves, right?
They tried to, they got permission from the curator to take some little samples of these dried dead leaves and get DNA out. And at the time they were not able to, but then fast forward 10 years. And in 2011, another Croatian research team with a lot of experience in samples from archaeological sites, they worked on those leaves in the museum. They were able to get DNA out of those leaves. And then Ivan and Eddie, my collaborators, they were then able to analyze the DNA from those leaves and they confirmed that it was indeed the same as Zinfandel. So that was now a very, very important historical connection, because that shows that around the year 1900, this grape Tribidrag was being grown. And a Croatian historian was enlisted to jump in and see what he could find out about Tribidrag. And what he found out was that Tribidrag was widely grown, widely known. It is in all kinds of documents, even some documents in Venice, which at the time was the city-state on the other side of the Adriatic, an important trading partner with the city of Split and Dubrovnik. And so he was able to find that Tribidrag was a significant variety as far back as the 1300s. And so that is what is really important, is that the fact that Tribidrag was referenced by name, which is very unusual, or back in the Middle Ages, people didn't really call varieties by name. So it was in trade records, tax records, wills. So what we know then is that this was a very significant variety. It was traded across the Adriatic. So that means that in the 1300s, it was already a widely grown grape. And we know that Cabernet Sauvignon wasn't even born till the 1700s. So let's hear it for Tribidrag. I mean, it's an ancient wine grape. We haven't paid much attention to Central Europe. We tend to be so focused on Western Europe.
Right.
The wine culture is perhaps even more ancient in Central Europe. So the reason that we call our Zinfandel wine Tribidrag is to constantly remind people, to beat them over the head with this point, that Tribidrag, AKA Zinfandel, is an ancient and noble grape. And I think that we should be a little more respectful, particularly in the winemaking. I think a lot of times people treat it as though it's going to be just a kind of run-of-the-mill ordinary wine. And so perhaps they won't give it their full attention in the winery or in the vineyard. So I would like people to
Well, and I spend a lot of time tasting Zinfandel as well as a lot of other varieties. And the thing that's clear is that Zinfandel is at least as site expressive as Pinot Noir. It really shows where it's grown and shows a lot of contrast. When it's done with respectful farming and respectful winemaking, it really expresses where it's from, and side by side tastings show that, the difference between mountain fruit, valley floor fruit, for example, and different sites. One of the things, just to clarify some questions people are getting, is what we know is that Zinfandel, under a different name, was brought to, actually, I believe, the Boston area, and was found in a nursery there in, I think it was the 1830s. And then it made its way over to California in the 1850s. And between those two stops, it picked up the name Zinfandel. No one has been able to figure out where the name Zinfandel came from. We just know it appeared there before the 1850s on its way to California. And do you know, though, the parents of the variety?
No, unfortunately, we don't. And there's been a lot of genetic erosion in Croatia because it was kind of a backwater, a viticultural backwater. It got heavily, and because it was communist for quite a long time, a lot of old vineyards were lost. And so a lot of the cultural heritage has been lost. So when Ivan and Eddie have surveyed all the varieties in Croatia, they have found some old traditional varieties, but they have yet to find the parents of Zinfandel. It's pretty clear that is its home, because so many of the traditional Croatian varieties are closely related to Zinfandel.
Right.
We're pretty sure that's its home, but we haven't been able to go any further back.
So we had, there's so much to talk about in that subject, but I want to remind people that you've done multiple interviews on it as well, and so people could also look those up to learn more. But I asked if you were interested in selecting a third wine, and I'm really excited to look at the third wine. And so could the both of you tell us what you chose and why you chose it?
Well, we chose, I don't know if you can see the bottle, but we chose the Truchard Roussanne. And we did that because I just love this wine. I just love this wine. We don't make any white wines ourselves, and so I'm always on the lookout for nice white wines. And I'm not even sure where we first had this, but we are friends with the Truchard family, have known them for quite some time. And their Roussanne, it's just a wonderful, wonderful wine. And so it's something that we always have on hand here. And in fact, when we were preparing for this webinar, we had to make sure that Steve and I had some Roussanne here. I said, well, that's no problem, because we always have the Truchard Roussanne here. So we didn't have to go to any extra trouble to get it. So
well, because you actually trade wine with the Truchards, don't you?
Yes, we do.
We trade with a number of producers, and it's great to drink wines who are made by your friends, and you know everything about them, where they're from, and how they're made. It's really neat. Anthony Truchard's going to come online here fairly soon. I met Anthony's dad, Tony, and his mom, Joanne, years ago, 30 years ago. He was a real inspiration for us, because here's a guy who, about 15 years before we came to Napa Valley, he came to Napa Valley with nothing. And then he decided to buy a piece of property in a place where almost nobody was growing grapes, down in Carneros then. And he broke all the rules. And here it is, all these years later, a successful vineyard and winery. And the Roussanne is just a kind of a tribute to all of that. It's just incredible wine, and they're an incredible story.
Well, I really love the Truchard Roussanne myself. It's something that I have used in seminars, and Anthony and I were able to do a presentation together in Canada quite a few years ago now, but specifically on the Roussanne. And so Anthony, we're lucky to have Anthony actually here, and they're in the cellar. But quickly, Anthony, let's go ahead and look at the map so we can clarify to people where your where your family vineyard is located. And one of the things I love about this is you can see there, Truchard is located right there in Carneros. This map that Katie's made so clearly shows how Carneros spreads across both Napa County and Sonoma County pretty evenly. But you'll notice there, Truchard is in Carneros, but in another sense, it really is more, you could think of it as the foothills of Mount Veeder. And so I love this pairing that we've come up with here with Lagier Meredith and Truchard, because they're in two different appellations, two different parts of Napa Valley, but they're really actually in the same mountain range and not that far from each other. Anthony, could you go ahead and tell us, your vineyard there is quite unique within Carneros. Could you go ahead and tell us about that?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Elaine, for having us, and proud to be here with Steve and Carole. Yeah, one of the unique things about our vineyard, and hopefully there's not too much echo here in the cave, but one of the unique things about our vineyard is because it's in that northern part of Carneros, it has a lot more hillsides than the rest of Carneros, and then the soil types are a lot different. So it's interesting hearing Carole and Steve say how they're on a marine sediment uprising in the middle of volcanics, and we're almost the opposite. We're on where the Roussanne is grown is volcanic soils that are surrounded by most of the clay and marine sediment here in Carneros.
But you have incredibly varied soils in that, and also really varied aspects, and that allows you to grow quite a big range of varieties too, right?
Yeah, two reasons. One, we have about 270 acres of vineyard, so with that space, we can sacrifice an acre here or there to experiment, and one of the reasons we planted Roussanne, but also, as you mentioned, the soil types are really varied. And I know it gets complicated because we're 100% in Napa and 100% in Carneros, but I kind of like to say it's where Napa Valley meets Carneros, because Carneros traditionally is cooler clay soils, a little bit more kind of rolling hills, while Napa, you picture is these volcanic hills, great alluvial soils, and a little bit warmer. And our property kind of straddles both sides. The northern part is definitely more volcanic, probably some of the steepest hills and highest elevations in Carneros, and really well-drained soils, which Carneros is not known for. And then the southern portion of our property, where we grow more of the classic Chardonnay and Pinot, has that classic clay, marine sediment, a lot denser, traps in the moisture, keeps the acidity is really high.
Well, and it's really unusual to have a site where you can grow Pinot and Chardonnay and also grow Cabernet, Roussanne, Merlot. That's actually quite a big range, and really speaks to the varied topography and soil types on your vineyard.
No, exactly. I mean, when we had that earthquake back in 2014, we had all these fault traces through the property. We could literally see the property sliding. We're not seeing it sliding, but post-slide, and things moving, foot here and foot there. And one side rocky, volcanic, and the other clay. And that's been happening, for millions of years. So it really has made it quite diverse.
Well, because you're actually incredibly close to the epicenter of the 2014 earthquake.
Yeah, and exactly. And a lot of those fault lines went through our property.
Right. And I might point out too that actually the 2017 fires essentially surrounded the Lagier Meredith property. And of course, we're now all home in a pandemic. So it's been a great run for all of us in the north coast of California.
That's why we drink wine.
Yeah.
Waiting for the asteroid impact.
Hopefully we have a few years before we get to that one. But I want to make sure that everyone understands too, Truchard, when your family planted the vineyard, Truchard actually was the first viable ongoing vineyard to be done in Carneros. There are a couple of experimental plantings, but there's very little water available in Carneros, and so those didn't last. But you actually, again, your placement in Carneros means you had a unique situation where you could actually have a pond.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the big challenges of Carneros back in the 70s, is because of those clay soils, there's not a lot of groundwater, and we're also very close to the San Pablo Bay. We're about 5-6 miles. So when you drill for water, sometimes you will find it down about 400 or 500 feet. But unlike Carole and Steve, not very good quality water. It's lots of salt in it from the bay. And so that was a lot of the challenge of this area. One, people thought it was cool, but just the availability of water here. And with those clay soils, we only have about 2 feet of topsoil. So we really needed to irrigate. And that was, there was a few viable vineyards that did have natural lakes on their properties, but we were one of the first to kind of build these man-made lakes out of clay, which retain the water great. And then also one of the early people to use drip irrigation rather than watering the whole fields or doing overhead sprinklers. We were just metering out a little bit for each plant. And so, yeah, that was what enabled us to start with, 20 acres in 1973. And now we have about 420 acres, 270 are planted with grapes. But yeah, using those technologies allowed us to kind of come to an area that, had maybe been passed over because of the lack of water.
Well, and the thing is, Carneros has a really persistent cooling effect too, because it is so close to the bay. But I want to highlight something you just said. So you started planting in 1973 with drip irrigation, which had only just arrived in North America. It was, of course, originally invented in Israel to help farm the desert to make food for people there. But the fact that your family not only had the vision to move to an area relatively unplanted, but also to harness new water conserving and directing technology like drip irrigation, is pretty remarkable. It's another thing that we take for granted today, but it's actually something that your family helped show could work for grapevines here in California.
No, exactly. Like Steve said, my dad did break a lot of rules and go against conventional wisdom. But one of the great things about Napa in the early 70s is you could afford to do that. The land was fairly inexpensive. And so you could buy a little bit and, try farming. And it wasn't like you were, betting the ranch on everything. It was the values of land were a lot cheaper back then.
Well, and something I admire about both of your wineries too is you did each acquire your land at a time when things were incredibly less expensive, and in both cases you've reflected that in maintaining lower prices in the wines. And it would be very easy for a winery to just keep increasing their prices and increasing their profits, but with both Lagier Meredith and Truchard, you've actually maintained more approachable pricing. And you can do that partially because your cost of land is lower thanks to when you bought it. That's something I really appreciate that both of you do. So one of the things, Steve and Carole, you of course know Anthony's parents and also Anthony. And I would just want, what is it that you want to ask Anthony now that you have him on camera and on the hook, he has to answer?
Put the bright light on him first.
I'll lean back, get the cave lights on my eyes.
I think I don't really want to ask this of Anthony, but I think it's important to note that Truchard is a family winery, and that succession is always a big issue in a family-owned winery. And I would think that that is a complicated situation. And I think that's a big challenge. A corporate winery, whether it's public or privately held, that's a lot different. That is a business, whereas a family-owned enterprise, that is a life. And it cannot be treated the same. So I think when a family owns a business, and it's now moved into its second generation, and there's a third generation coming on, I've got to think that's something that the family must think about quite a lot.
Well, and Anthony, you had an entirely different career and chose to come back to be part of Truchard.
Yeah, no, I grew up here on the property, and I have a brother and 4 sisters, and we grew up on the weekends working in the vineyards, and often during the busy times of the year, we actually go in before school and work an hour or 2 in the vineyards and after school as well. So the vineyards were always kind of part of my childhood growing up, but like most people, they grow up on a farm, and I think sometimes people forget that farming vineyards is still farming. It's a farm. So when I graduated from high school, I wanted to get off the farm, and I went to school, practiced law in New York for a few years, and then realized that life in Napa wasn't so bad, and I came back here about 15 years ago to manage the winery side. But I wanted to leave California, not because California wasn't great, but I wanted to see what else was out there, and realized that farming in Napa Valley is a great option.
Well, and we spoke to how Carole and Steve are actually doing the work themselves, and your dad is actually out on the tractor today. right?
Yes, yes. I actually had to move. I don't know if you noticed. I had to move deeper into the cage because they started disking above me, and I'm like, oh, of course, of days of all days.
But your dad is actually 82 and still does tractor work in the vineyard.
Yeah, exactly. That's what keeps him healthy and alive. And we asked him, how's this quarantining affecting him? And he said, not really that much at all. I don't. I just go out in the vineyards and spend the time with my vines.
Well, that's great. So Carole and Steve, one of the things that someone's asked too is just if you could talk to some of the white varieties that grow actually in Mount Veeder. You know, we've been talking about Roussanne and Carneros, which again is a little bit unusual for that region. It tends to be known more for Pinot and Chardonnay, but Anthony's unique position there allows him to grow some varieties that need a little bit more warmth. But there in Mount Veeder, are there other white varieties that you see successfully growing as well?
Well, there's some Chardonnay that's grown up here, and there's a small amount of Viognier. Aaron Pott has a little bit of Viognier that makes sense. And the Chardonnay and the Viognier make wonderful, wines. Carol's gone. Fading back in. Reminds me of a Star Trek episode.
Yeah.
Where Kirk suspended out in space and disappearing in and out of reality.
We can do Star Trek fan fiction webinars after this.
Okay. Anyway, there's only a small amount of white grapes. There's obviously most of Mount Veeder is planted to cab family varieties, but Hess makes very nice Chardonnay grown up here, and Aaron's Viognier is spectacular.
Yeah, it's great. So Anthony, I want to ask again, I should, just to be fair, reverse the question. You have Steve and Carole here on the hook. Is there anything that you'd like to ask them?
Oh, that's a good question. I always ask when they're in need of other more Roussanne because I love trading with them.
I want a little Pinot.
I know.
Carole always wants Roussanne. I'd like to get a little Pinot.
Honey, we traded with you just a few weeks ago, and I got 2 cases of your Roussanne, and I've only got 7 bottles left. So.
No.
We might have a problem here.
Yeah. Your wines don't last very long in our cellar. Actually, Carole was one of the first people that we saw when this whole shutdown came in place. I think she got nervous and she called and she's like, I need to come down the hill and get some Roussanne right away.
Well, and the way that I heard the story too, she realized 1 case would not be enough. And it sounds like that's true.
No, we pretty much drank all of our Lagier Meredith. It's one of our favorite wines. I really respect what they do up there on the hill. And, like Steve was saying earlier, one of the things too, people ask us all the time when you're in the wine industry, what are you drinking? And I always say my friends' wines because you know how they're made, where they're made. And there's a lot of great wines out there. And it's great to support, some of the smaller wineries and some of your friends more than anything.
Great. Well, so we're actually out of time. And again, I really want to thank all 3 of you for making time today. All 3 of you are very hands-on with your businesses, the vineyards and the wineries. And this is one of the busiest times of year actually for wineries, which a lot of people don't realize. It's actually such a swift growing season at this point of the year that everything needs to be well in place so that later in the year during harvest, it'll be in good condition. So thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedules. I really appreciate it. And it's great to get the 3 of you together. It's always fun to have such long-standing friends chat with each other.
Our pleasure.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Steve and Carole. And thank you to all of our attendees. So a reminder that a recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all participants will receive an email with the link. And we also hope that you'll join us next week for a new chapter of the Behind the Wines series with a focus on illustrating California terroir through the lens of the state's classic grape varieties. So we're going to kick it off with Tegan Pasalacqua of Turley Cellars to explore the site-expressive qualities of Zinfandel in Lodi. So the webinar will take place next Tuesday, June 2nd at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you all again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.